then all of a sudden, oh, 1 second. Here's Sandy now. I'm gonna mute myself and talk to Sandy. Hello, Sandy. It's Rabbi Jim. I just wondered if you wanted to join us. If you wanted to join us for the. Sorry, we weren't. It starts right now. All in the people. All right. Wait. So, all right. So I apologize for that interruption, but Sandy's going to join us. Good. Okay. So David was able to always do exactly what was needed to disturb him. And then when he's bathing, right, bathing. Oh, here's Sandy, and I wonder what this. Hello, Sandy. Yes, exactly. Yep. All of a sudden, everything he sort of go into kind of a funk, and he very it's very mysterious why all of a sudden David, who seems to have been able to do everything quote unquote correctly, now seems to be just a lump, and so Luke is the child that he has with Bathsheba, the first child. Then, of course, they have a second child, Solomon, and for whatever reason falls in love with Solomon.
Rabbi,
Go ahead, Ann.
the sound is not very good. Maybe we should have everybody mute themselves.
You know what?
There's sort of a pounding going on.
Somebody's breathing. We hear somebody breathing heavily, and that's disturbing.
So I've just muted everybody.
Heavy breathing.
Yeah, and if you want to say something, if you're on the screen, then wave at me. And if you are on the phone, just push *9, and that will raise your hand so that I will notice that you want to speak. So
The sound is much better now.
yes, it is really much better when everyone else is muted. Zoom really does better when there's only one person at a time. It's just a quirk of Zoom. So what I was saying is that David becomes very, very passive, and we find that that this is especially true when his son Absalom is incensed because David, when his other son Amnon rapes his half sister Tamar, right? David echoes Jacob, who doesn't react, right? He notices it, he doesn't approve of it, he's angry about it, he's upset about it, but he doesn't do anything, right? He just sort of becomes immobilized, which is really an interesting psychological portrait, right, of people who, when they're presented with overwhelming events, right, we have 3 different responses to situations that are overwhelming, right? We can fight, we can flee, or we can freeze, right? And it seems like in this case, what David does is freeze. And what's really interesting is that he continues to freeze. And so Absalom, right, kills Amnon in revenge for the rape of Tamar, and then David is upset, and Absalom flees. Go ahead, Jeannie.
Does Absalom kill Amnon, or have the other brothers do it?
Yeah, I think. Well, yeah, right.
He has him killed, because all the way through the book, somebody has someone like Saul people get other people to kill people. I forget the examples.
Absalom doesn't do it himself, right?
Why doesn't he do it himself?
I don't know, but it's interesting because I had actually forgotten that detail, Jeannie, right? Because of the chapters that we're currently reading, right, which are so very focused on the fact that
they don't want to carry the blood guilt.
Right, but the point is that Absalom does carry the blood guilt, right? That's the That's the issue.
Yeah.
That it's a that the blood guilt is there, right? The blood guilt is a concept in the ancient world, right? That if you kill somebody, you have incurred blood guilt, right? And that the relatives of the person you killed are responsible for killing you, right? And that's kind of where we start, right? Because we start at this point where Absalom has fled because he's afraid that David will kill him, right, for the murder of Amnon. But you know what I think that the sort of portrait we get of David, right, is one of deep ambivalence. You know, he sort of wants to avenge Amnon, and he is also, you know, very concerned for his boy Absalom. He doesn't want Absalom to suffer or to be killed. So these two things are happening at the same time, and that paralysis that we see in David, right, seems to embolden Absalom to do what he does, right, which is basically to stage a coup very neatly, right. So that's the sort of summary up till now. So I'm going to put up on the screen. I'll put up not Alter's translation, but a different translation. Okay. All right. So you will see on the screen, right? Right. 2 Samuel chapter 14. Okay. All right. So this very interesting, very interesting word. Now Joab, the son of Zeruiah, perceived that the king's heart was toward Absalom. Right, very interesting. Al Avshalom. Alter translates it as that it was on, right? It was on Absalom. Very interesting. He suggests, right, that it could also mean against, right? That he is still angry, still upset, still wanting revenge. And Joab sent to Tekoa and fetched a wise woman, right? And Alter talks here, right? And I think this is so interesting, right? Because we are so focused, and I think appropriately so, right, on the patriarchal flavor of the Bible, right? That, you know, the men are what matter, the women are afterthoughts, right? You know, especially in this book where the heroes are all these military guys, you know, running around and killing each other and fighting battles and sending in spies and all this sort of thing. But it's so interesting, right, that so much of the action is mediated by these really wise women. Not all of them get that designation in the text, but many of them, you know, would seem to deserve it. Excuse me. Whatever the obvious misogyny of the text, which is undeniable, right? There is also this real admiration for women as well, which is a very interesting thing, right? And also interesting, right, that Joab sends a woman to do this, right? And said unto her, take up mourning and don garments and do not rub yourself with oil, and you should be like a woman in mourning over a dead one, and you shall come to the king and speak to him in this matter. And Joab put the words in her mouth, right? A very interesting idea, right? And again, Alter points out, right, that generally what we have in situations like this, when someone says, go to John Doe, and this is what you're going to tell him, right? And then generally the Bible will say, and he said this, and then Joe Blow goes, right, to go see Joe Schmo, and we hear this usually a slightly different version, right, of what what that person said. But in this case, right, Joab puts words in her mouth, but we didn't hear what Joab's version of it was. We only hear hers, right? Which makes sense, I think, from two perspectives. First of all, as Alter points out, right, there's a lot. It's not really known to Joab or to this woman how David is going to react, right? So there has to be a lot of improvisation in her behavior. The other reason I would say, right, is that the whole thing is quite long, and it would go against sort of the biblical emphasis on economy to repeat this entire thing. Okay, so what's the story? What's the story that she tells him?
She is a widow herself, and one son killed another, and now the crowd wants to kill the son that killed his brother. And that would leave her deceased husband with no one to carry on his name.
Great summary.
Right.
Well done.
Really.
Thank you. That was by the skin of my teeth. Thank you very much.
Right. And so clearly, right, this is somehow connected, right, to the situation that David finds himself in. Right? But so interesting to me, why does Joab, choose a woman to come and tell this story, right? When we had Bathsheba, right, when David took Bathsheba and killed Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, right, Nathan comes and tells a very similar story. But here, Joab doesn't rely upon Nathan, right? Doesn't even go and tell him himself, right? He sends a woman to tell this story. I mean, and this is a real question. I don't have a great answer for it. I'm just wondering, why you think, right, that he might have why Joab might have sent a woman as opposed to finding some other way of managing this situation. Yeah, go ahead, Jeannie.
Maybe it makes it more distant. David is less defensive. She's couching, she's hiding from him. The metaphor, it was reminiscent of the metaphor about the poor man with the ewe that he loved so much that he kept in his lap, and that a rich man came and took the ewe and ate her.
Right. Exactly. But so I mean, so maybe there's a distance, right? Or maybe there's a right, because it will not be immediately obvious to David.
Sympathy. Maybe there's more sympathy.
Right. There's a way that David will react initially, at least, right, with a kind of empathy for the woman, right, as opposed to immediately seeing through the parable, right? All right. So we'll continue, right? And so the king says to the woman, right, "Go to thy house, I will give a charge concerning thee." Right. Very interesting, right, that she keeps on pushing him. And Alter is very helpful because I couldn't understand, why does she keep on pushing and keep on talking as opposed to being satisfied with what David says, right? Right. So the woman says, "My lord, O king, the iniquity be on me, right, and on my father's house, and the king and his throne be guiltless," right? And the idea being, right, that she is saying, right, that if the blood guilt is not avenged, right, then she becomes liable to the violence that would otherwise be put on her son. Right, and so he seems to understand that, and says, "Whoever, what does it says? Whoever says anything to you, bring him to me, and he shall not touch you anymore." Right, and then she keeps going, right, and she said that it's actually I really appreciate that you won't let them hurt me, but my real goal here is to make sure that my son, right, will not be killed by these people. And so he says, right, let thy handmaid, I pray thee, speak a word. Oh, wait a second. As the Lord liveth, there shall not one hair of thy son fall to the earth. Right? And Alter points out, hold on one second. And Alter points out how interesting that is, right? That David uses that metaphor, right, of hair, right? Because Absalom's hair becomes quite the object of inquiry. You know that he's got the most beautiful hair you've ever had. I mean, I'm so jealous of Absalom. You know, he's got this amazing hair, and I have no hair. It's just not fair. And so you know, and so that he cuts his hair off every year, and so on and so forth. We'll get to that. It's like he's Samson, right? And Alter makes a point that Absalom seems to be compared explicitly to Samson, so anyway, so then she sort of says, she sort of shifts when we get to verse 12. She sort of shifts and says, "Wait, you have a banished one," which to David must I can only imagine to David it must have sort of come somewhat out of nowhere, right? Like this woman is talking about her own situation, and then all of a sudden she brings up his son who's been banished, right? And so he does. So she is somehow now imploring him to bring back Absalom, right? All right. So, and what's interesting, right? And I think that what I find so interesting about this, right, is that David says to her, and the king answered and said unto the woman, hide not from me, I pray thee, aught that I shall ask thee. And the woman said, let my lord the king now speak. And the king said, is the hand of Joab with thee in all this? And the woman answered and said, as thy soul liveth, thy lord the king, none can turn to the right hand or to the left from aught that my lord the king hath spoken. And so for my servant Job he bade me, and he put all these words in the mouth of thy handmaid. Change the face of the matter, hath thy servant done this thing? My Lord is wise, according to the wisdom of an angel of God, to know all the things that are in the earth. Right? And very interesting, right, that she sort of flatters him. On one hand, she's flattering him and saying, you know everything that's going on, even though that's clearly not true. Right? He doesn't really know what's going on with Absalom, and will not know what's going on with Absalom in the following chapter, right? Where what does Absalom is basically taking over the city, and David seems to be completely oblivious to what Absalom is doing. So clearly it's not true. Yet there does seem to be a moment here where it's like, oh, wait a second, David is beginning to sort of figure out some stuff again. Like he's beginning to have this sort of idea that he knows he sort of is beginning to get some of his mojo back, right? He's like, oh yeah, this is Joab. Now, Alter says that there's a scholar who suggests that Joab actually wanted David to know, right, that Joab was in this, right? That Joab is that sort of tricky. Like it was not, he didn't want to start the process, but he did want to be associated with this desire to develop a rapprochement between David and Absalom. And the king said, so now the woman disappears, right? As this is the way the Bible works, right? This is what the angel, this woman, the wise woman of Tekoa, is like an angel, right? What they say about angels in the rabbinic tradition is that once once an angel has fulfilled its duty, right, it goes back up to heaven, and right, and we never see it again, right? So this is like the wise woman of Tekoa, right? She shows up, she does her job, she does it brilliantly, she does it exactly correctly, right? And as soon as her job is done, boom, she's gone, right? And we never see her again. All right, and so so
Hey,
go ahead.
it's an amazing conversation.
Incredible, yeah.
And I think maybe they made it a woman because only a woman could have well, had the emotional dexterity she needed at that point.
Yeah, I mean, right.
More characteristic of women than of men.
Right. I mean, I think that's a reasonable assumption in the context of the times, right? Where there's a where the pathos, right, of a widow is very, very different than the pathos of a bereaved father. And the reason being, right, that the widow is concerned not only for herself, right, but also for the fate of her husband's name, right? So that ends up entering into the conversation, right, in this patriarchal society. So David is moved by this, right, in part because he understands, oh yeah, if this guy's second son dies, right, then he's going to have no heir, right, and his sort of line will disappear from the earth. So yeah, and I think that is very important. All right.
The position of women is abhorrent,
Well,
absolutely abhorrent.
I mean, absolutely, right? Absolutely. The in a patriarchal, in an explicitly patriarchal society, right? The status of women is very constrained. I think as we said, and you might not have been here yet, quite yet, Sandy. What we said earlier about, which is so interesting about this book of the Bible, but really most books of the Bible, right, is the degree to which women play pivotal roles in many episodes, right? So it's very clear that the writers of the Bible, even though they are fully implicit, shall we say, in the patriarchal system that they depict, right? They also understand that even in a patriarchal system, right, women have a certain amount of power that allows them to function in ways that men cannot, right? So that's I think what Betsy was getting at, right? That there's a reason why the person who plays this particular role, right, and demonstrates such unbelievable emotional and political intelligence, that this person has to be a woman, right? Go ahead, Jeannie. Oh, you're muted, Jeannie. Jeannie, you're muted.
I lost my picture, so then I couldn't unmute myself without my picture. I'm just going to say that if Absalom is killed, the same is not true of David and Absalom, as the widow who says that her husband's name would be lost, because if Absalom is killed, he's got a whole bunch of brothers still floating around.
Exactly.
So it may be a little hard to pick up on the analogy because it's not the same. David's name is going to continue.
David's name would continue, but I think what's interesting, right, is that Absalom, if I recall correctly, and this I'm on a little bit of shaky ground, but if I recall correctly, that Absalom is the one of his sons, right, who actually has a royal mother, right? So that there's a way in which he is sort of the most obvious heir.
So you mean Bathsheba is royalty?
No, Bathsheba is not.
Who's his mother? Who's Absalom's mother?
I don't recall off the, but it's somebody from Geshur. She's a princess, right? She's the daughter of a king, right? Unlike most of his other wives, she's the daughter of a king. So I think there may be that sort of like, you don't want to lose track of this one because and part of it, right? And this actually is a very nice transition, Jeannie, right? Is that part of it is that Joab seems to understand in a way that David seemingly does not, right? That Absalom, both because of his own sort of personality, but also, and maybe because of his hair, but also because of his consciousness, right? That he himself is royalty, right? He's royalty on both sides, as opposed to all of the others, all the other children of the king who are royalty on their father's side, but not necessarily on their mother's side, right? That he might have the idea of overthrowing the king.
Well, it's interesting that Joab plays this role. He's sort of underappreciated. I mean, I don't know.
It's really interesting.
It's pretty impressive that Joab plays this very important role.
And Alter suggests, right? Alter suggests that he plays this role, but that actually it was a mistake to bring Absalom back, right? Because it allowed Absalom to function in Jerusalem in developing, and sort of building up his power and overthrowing the king, as opposed to leaving him isolated and exiled, right? So on one hand, yes, Joab is being canny. On the other hand, it seems to be a mistake. And Alter even suggests that maybe Joab is trying to play both sides, right? Trying to curry favor with Absalom, and if David is not going to bring Absalom back, then Joab might go and join him. So the king said, "Go, I've granted this request. Go and bring the young man Absalom back." Right, and Joab fell to the ground. Right, this is the second of the prostrations before David. Right, the first one was the widow of Tekoa. The wise woman of Tekoa. The second one is Joab, and then at the end of the chapter we have Absalom doing it. Right, and so Joab went to Geshur and brought Absalom to Jerusalem. So Geshur is, the place where his grandfather is. And the king said, "Let him turn to his own house, but let him not see my face." Right? Very interesting. I don't entirely understand it. Right? Why would David agree with Joab to bring Absalom home, right? But then not actually reconcile with him, right? It seems like a self-defeating half measure, right? And the only thing I can think of, right, is that it bespeaks again David's ambivalence. Right, that David has this ambivalence about Absalom. Right, on one hand, he still hates him for killing Amnon, and on the other hand, right, he's concerned about him. Right, so now in all of Israel, there was none to be so much praised as Absalom for his beauty. From the sole of his foot even to the crown of his head, there was no blemish in him. Oh, if only. I mean, just starting with the soles of my feet, there's nothing but trouble. But when he pulled his head, and I think pulled his head must mean cut his hair. It was now at every year's end that he cut it because the heavy hair was heavy on him. Therefore, he pulled it. He weighed the hair of his head at 200 shekels after the king's weight. Right, so you can sort of imagine how much hair he had. Right, he had 200 shekels worth of hair that he had to cut off every year. Otherwise, his pull his neck down. And Absalom had 3 sons and 1 daughter, who was Tamar, who was beautiful, named, I guess, after the sister. The Alter points out 2 things. First of all, that it's very unusual, right, for the daughter to be named while the sons are left unnamed. So again, sort of this chapter is very women focused. And the second odd thing about this is that there's another tradition that said Absalom didn't have any children, right? So again, we are left with the reality, right, that the Bible is very comfortable, including contradictory traditions, right? Okay, and so Absalom dwelt 2 years in Jerusalem, and he never saw the king. And then Absalom sent for Joab to send him to the king, and Joab would not come. So he sent a second time, but he wouldn't come. This is sort of like, you're calling somebody about something and they just won't return your calls, and you get very, very annoyed, right? If you're a normal person, you're just like, okay, I'm annoyed. If you're Absalom, or if you're a mafia don, right, what do? You say, let's show him who's who, right? And so he said, therefore he said to his servants, see, Job's field is near mine, and he hath barley there. Go set it on fire. So, like, I'm going to get his attention no matter what, right? And so that got Joab's attention, right? He goes to Absalom, and that means that he gets Joab, right? He gets Joab to reconnect him with David, right? And the reconciliation scene, right, is really fascinating, right? There are no tears, right? There's no speeches, right? There's no nothing, right? So Joab came to the king, and when he had called for Absalom, he came to the king and bowed himself on his face to the ground before the king, and the king kissed Absalom, right? Not David. It's not David that kissed Absalom, it's the king, right? So there's no indication that David has really changed his opinion or his feeling about Absalom at all, right? There's like this coldness that seems to remain here. All right, so let's go to the next chapter. All right. So this chapter I just found to be completely amazing. And so we'll go through it, and please, and as always, please don't hesitate to ask questions of the group and to make comments. And it came to pass after this that Absalom prepared for himself chariot and horses and 50 men to run before him. Right, so he's clearly setting himself up as a king, right, or at least as a crown prince. And he used to rise up early and stand beside the way of the gate, such that when any man had a suit which he should come to the king for judgment, Absalom would call to him and said, of what city are you from? And the person would say, oh, I'm from one of the tribes of Israel. And Absalom said unto him, see, thy matters are good and right, but there is no man deputed of the king to hear thee. So he's sort of sowing dissatisfaction with the king's regime, right? And Absalom said moreover, oh, that if I were made judge in the land, that every man who had any suit or cause might come unto me, and I would do him justice, right? I mean, this is like pure populist demagoguery, right? You just trust in me, and everything will be fine, right? No matter who comes to me, he's going to get what he wants, right? So even if obviously the things are completely contradictory, right? He's saying that it's like I won't go into what it's like because there's too many obvious parallels with someone who's currently in our world.
Our president.
That's what I was trying to say without saying it, Sandy. But thank you very much for.
You can come right out and say it.
I have to sometimes be politics, Sandy. Sometimes,
not here.
Not here. Okay, good.
No, we never would have guessed you were so subtle.
Exactly. All right. And so right. And so he says, and it was so that when any man came nigh to prostrate himself before him, he put forth his hand and took hold of him and kissed him. Right. I mean, it's fascinating, right? He seems to be sort of buying off everybody who comes near him, right? And convincing them to follow him as opposed to David, right? And on this manner did Absalom to all Israel that came to the king for judgment. And so Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. so interesting, right? And he's able to do this, and it appears, at least, right, that David is completely oblivious. Doesn't seem to have any idea, right? So the old adage, right, keep your friends close and your enemies closer, right? Whether David considered Absalom a friend or an enemy, right? He clearly didn't keep him close at all. And so Absalom was able to do all of this behavior, right? Which was, clearly is going to lead to disastrous consequences for the country. All right. And again, just so much contemporary resonance, right, of the degree to which I don't think it was the whole country that our current president stole the hearts of, but I think it's not unreasonable to say, right, that a large percentage of the Republican Party has, really given its heart to the president in a very, very profound and deep way. Without explicitly, making a judgment about the my feelings about the policies, which you can probably imagine what they are, right? That the affection that so many people have for Absalom, as so many people have affection for Trump, right? It's not based, right, on any sort of coherent political reality, right? Because you can't decide in favor of every single person, right? Because every single person is going to have an opponent, and the judge cannot judge in favor of both of them, right? So decisions do have to be made, right? And the promise of a demagogue, right, is that there's no trade-off to be made, right? And that's what Absalom seems to be doing here, right? And so at the end of 40 years, now our Alter says that 40 years is obviously impossible, and that there are other ancient translations of this book that say 4 years. So that's what he uses, is after 4 years. Right, so can you imagine this? 4 years, 4 years of this behavior. Absalom said unto the king, right, I pray thee, let me go and pay my vow, which I have vowed unto the Lord in Hebron. Right, for thy servant vowed a vow while I abode in Geshur, right, where that's his grandfather's place in Aram, saying, if the Lord shall indeed bring me back to Jerusalem, then I will serve the Lord. And the king said unto him, go in peace. I mean, it's unbelievable, right, that the king would sort of buy this hook, line, and sinker. And so he arose and went to Hebron. Right? But Absalom sent spies throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, as soon as ye hear the sound of the horn, then ye shall say, Absalom is king in Hebron. Right? So he's clearly setting to overthrow the king. And when Absalom went 200 men out of Jerusalem that were invited, and they went in their simplicity. Alter translates it as innocence, right? They had no idea. Right? But as soon as they're there, they're going to be sort of caught up in this insurrection without even knowing what they were getting into. And Absalom sent for Ahithophel, the Gilonite, David's counselor from his city, even from Gilo, while he offered the sacrifices, and the conspiracy was strong. People increased continually with Absalom. And there came a messenger to David saying, and again, like the hearts of the men of Israel are after Absalom, right? Or the hearts of the men of Israel follow, in a sense, right? They're going to follow Absalom. And David said, and this I find just amazing, right? That David, at this moment, right, David shifts again, right? He shifts back from the passive, sort of like frozen king who's completely isolated and alienated from the people around him, right? And he suddenly turns back into David, the David we knew, right? And he said to his servants that were with him in Jerusalem, arise and let us flee, right? Arise and let us flee, for else none of us shall escape from Absalom. Make speed to depart, lest he overtake us quickly and bring down evil upon us and smite the city with the edge of the sword. Right? So, and somebody, one of the people that Alter makes reference to, talks about this is where David really shines. Right? He doesn't do that well when he's sitting in his palace, right? But he does great when he's kicked out of his palace and he has to go into the wilderness, right? When he has to think on his feet, when he has to be, when he has to make decisions quickly and improvise, and he doesn't have all the trappings, right, of royalty. Then he does great, right? As soon as he has the trappings of royalty and he sits in his bed, he can't get out of bed every morning. He just hangs around and lets things happen and passively lets the world, take him. Right? And the king's servants said unto the king, behold, thy servants are ready to do whatsoever my lord the king shall choose. Right? So it's clear, right, that although the hearts of the people have been following Absalom, right, the hearts of David's servants are still with David. And then, so I just want to point out that, they go out, everyone goes out, right? And the servants passed on. And this word passed on or passed over or crossed over, I think is how Alter translates it, right? This ovrim it is, right? This verb happens again and again and again. Go ahead, Jeannie. You're muted.
Yeah, I was just going to say it did remind me of Abraham,
Yes.
right?
Right.
I don't know about other instances. You say it happens again and again. I don't know of the other instances.
No, what I mean is that verb reoccurs so many times in this one little passage, right? And Alter talks about how there's this like very slow moving convoy, right, of all these people that are fleeing from Jerusalem, but it doesn't happen quickly, right? It happens somewhat slowly, and with this sort of constant repetition of this verb ovrim, right? And so, and all of his servants passed, right? And all these people are, many of them are Philistines, right? Many of them are the Philistines that he had connected with when he was serving the Philistine king in Gath. Right, so interesting, right, that he has the loyalty of the Philistines, but he's lost the loyalty of the Israelites, right? It's just amazing, right, to sort of, so David, who is the, is the sort of renowned king of Israel, right, eventually is at least as it's presented in this chapter, will be saved and preserved as king, not by the Israelites, right, but by his Philistine allies. And we get an example of this, right, with Ittai, Gittite. And Ittai, this name, which is actually a fairly popular Israeli name, and I don't know if it's from this character or for somebody else, Ittai means with me. Right, that's the actual translation. It is with me, right? So the king says, "Why are you going? You're a foreigner. You're an exile. Like, why would you be following me?" Right? And Ittai says, as the Lord liveth, and as my lord the king liveth, surely in what place my lord the king shall be, whether for death or for life, even there also will thy servant be. Right, this strikes me, right, as the sort of masculine, martial version of what Ruth says to Naomi, right? Wherever you go, I'll go. Your God will be my God. Wherever you die, I will die. Wherever you stay, I will stay. Right? This is the the tough guy version of that. And it's just amazing to me, right, that he has this bond with this man. right? And all the country wept with a loud voice as all the people passed over, and the king passed over the brook Kidron. All the people passed over toward the way of the wilderness, right back into the Midbar, right? The Midbar, right, as you know, where the Israelites wandered for 40 years, right? They're going back into that Midbar. And Zadok also came, and all the Levites with him, bearing the ark of the covenant of God. And they set down the ark of God, and Abiathar went up until all the people had done passing out of the city. Right, and very interesting here, right, that the king says, "Go bring the ark of the covenant back." Right? Go bring it back. Why does he say that?
I think for two reasons. One is because his experience of having the ark around in the wilderness when he's fighting has not been good.
Right.
And I can't remember what the second was.
I mean, Alter suggests, and you know, I don't. This is just Alter's idea. You know, that for me, that's a real question. But what Alter suggests, right, is that this also gives him an opportunity, right, to have his priests who are loyal to him,
Spies.
right?
Spies.
Yes. So they will be able to give him intelligence about what's going on with Absalom in the capital when Absalom sets himself up as king, right? And then so they carried it back, right? And then this last piece is just amazing. Right? And David went up by the ascent of the Mount of Olives, and he wept as he went up, and he had his head covered or uncovered. It's unclear what that actually means, and went barefoot. And all the people that were with him covered every man his head, and they went up weeping as they went. And one told David, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom, right? And this is like really jarring for David, right? Because this was one of his main counselors, right? So he says, I pray thee, God, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. Undermine what he's going to do. And it came to pass when David was come to the top of the ascent where God was wont to be worshipped, behold, Hushai the Archite came to meet him with his coat rent and earth upon his head. Right? He's in mourning. Right? He's in mourning. And David said unto him, if you passest on with me, then thou wilt be a burden to me. But if thou return to the city and say unto Absalom, I will be your servant, O king, as I have been your father's servant in time past. So will I now be thy servant. Then wilt thou defeat for me the counsel of Ahithophel. Right? So David sees Hushai and immediately realizes, oh, I can use this guy, right, to counteract the counsel of my former counsel who turned against me. Right? And then he reminds him that Zadok and Abiathar will also be there, so that he's not alone, right? And so Hushai, David's friend, came into the city, and Absalom was at the point of coming into Jerusalem, right? So we're at this sort of like almost climax moment, right, where we're going to see the triumphant entrance of David's son, of him taking over the kingship from David, right? And I think the thing that I'll end on, right, is this remarkable thing, right, that we see in the Bible fairly often, right, is that there's no mention by the narrator, right, that God intervened here at all, right? God is only mentioned by David, right, when God is only mentioned by David when he hears about Ahithophel, right? And he says, God, foil Ahithophel's plans, right? But so interesting that the very next verse, right? Right? What does he see? Right? He sees this guy, right? Who is and he immediately hits upon, oh, this is how I can actually do what I asked God to do. Right? So there's a way in which, we can interpret this if we want to, right? That this is God's way of answering David's prayer, right? This is not, the theology here is not, right, that God is going to do it God's self, right? The theology is that God will provide ways for David to do what David wants God to do, right? And David has to be, active enough and clever enough to figure out how to manage that. And it appears, right, that he does. He sort of rises to the occasion, and Hushai goes down along with the other two guys to be spies in Absalom's camp. All right, so I'm going to stop the share. We're at time, so I know we need to stop, but I wanted just to give people a chance to respond and react, and any ideas you have, I'm happy to hear them.
I don't know why we honor David. He seems to me like a first-class jerk.
Well, that is, I think, one of the most interesting things, right, about reading this book, right? Because if we have the idea of King David, right, as we think of him, right, generally we think of David as being the great king, father of Solomon, the uniter of Israel, right, and the killer of Goliath, right? Like all these glorious things about David, right? We don't think about the way he is, as you say, a first-class jerk.
That's because we haven't read the book.
I think
I, for one,
well, actually,
hate him.
I mean, we can't accuse the rabbis, right, of not reading the book. Yet they definitely mythologize David in a pretty profound way. Which is, again, I don't have a good answer for you, Sandy, but I think
Misogynists, they are, all of them.
to be sure. But I'm not sure that they were worse than the other people in the ancient world. That's.
But I think you have to read something on its own terms.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're gonna fight patriarchy, then it may not serve you to read the Bible. It's kind of stupid. I mean, it's a patriarchal society, so.
I think that the two things are not mutually exclusive. I think in actual fact, in order to fight patriarchy, we have to have a deep understanding of it, and sort of understand, the ways, right, that women are not powerless in a patriarchy, right, and that and the way that people who are not dominant in various societies have a way, right, of asserting their own power, and there's sort of
That's true.
worse ways of doing that, or more successful and less successful ways of doing that. Jody, you've been quiet all night. What's up? Jody, you're muted. I'm sorry. I wish I could unmute people, but I can't. There you go.
I'm so sorry, but it's better that I be quiet. My migraines have been acting up something awful. But I'm listening, I'm with you, but I just can't participate.
Just fine. I just missed all your questions, Dodie. So when you're finished,
Oh,
I look forward to having questions.
thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. We will continue with the next 2 or 3 chapters for next week.
Great class.
Thank you very much. There'll be chapters 16, probably 16, 17, 18, maybe. We'll see how many. These chapters were so involved that I just couldn't rush through them. But we'll see. All right. Thanks again, everybody.
Good
Okay.
night.
Good night.